lot of times, we say things like that, but hearing God in the simple things of life it's actually not all that challenging if you just kind of start giving it a whirl. And one day, for instance, I was just driving my son Samuel and my nephew Zane to school. It was a 40-degree day, blue skies, driving him in the car, listening to Andrea Bocelli on the radio. And all of a sudden, little Zane in the back, he was about 4 at the time, he says, "Uncle Jason, I can't hear the music, Uncle Jason." And so I turned the radio up a little bit. He said, a few minutes later, he yells at me, Uncle Jason, I can't hear the music, Uncle Jason." So I turned the radio up a little bit more. A few minutes later, Uncle Jason, I can't hear the music, Uncle Jason." Finally, I said, "Zane, I cannot turn up the music any louder. It's going to hurt our ears. Uncle Jason's already deaf." And Samuel leans over to me and he says, "Dad, Zane doesn't want you to turn up the radio. He wants you to turn off the radio and roll down the windows." And I said, "All right." But I said it in a way that I was just being flippant. I just was doing what they wanted so they'd be happy. I get them to school. I rolled down all the windows, turned off the radio, and all of a sudden they started going crazy. Woo! And I look and the wind's blowing through their hair. And I get them to school and I drop them off and they said, "Thanks, Uncle Jason. Thanks, Dad. Love you. See ya." And they close the door, and I'm driving out of the parking lot of the school, and all of a sudden the Spirit of the Lord is on me so much, or my spirit is open to the Spirit. I don't know how that all works, but I just said, "Holy smokes, what just happened?" And I went back to the house and I looked up Zane's name on the internet. And his name means beautiful or handsome and that kind of thing, but it also means friend of the wind and the sea. And I couldn't help but think of Jesus out there. Jesus actually in many places coming to the disciples in the places that they were most afraid of. You know, back in that day, the sea was a ferocious terror to the disciples. That's why when Jesus is sleeping on the boat and they're all awake, it's quite interesting, you know. I mean, that's such a beautiful poetic concept if you just take the contrast of the disciples being freaked out on the boat when the wind and the waves of the sea are tossing over the boat and Jesus is sleeping, and the disciples getting upset at Jesus for him being asleep, right? And then when something eternal's going on in Gethsemane and Jesus wants his disciples to stay awake, when there's that kind of turbulence that Jesus is awake for, you see? Something eternal that really matters. The disciples can't stay awake, but Jesus gets upset at them. That contrast is important to see. It's in there for a reason in the scriptures. And a lot of times we're awake for the things that don't really keep Jesus awake. And we're asleep on the things that are really, Jesus is really awake for. And I just started thinking, Jesus often came to the disciples and often comes to us in the people. We talked about this yesterday. In the people that maybe we don't like as much or we don't agree with as much. In the places that we are the most afraid, Jesus comes and he reaches out his hand and he says, "We can be friends if you want to. Take my hand, come and walk with me, Jason. Take my hand and come and walk with me, Peter. Just keep your eyes on me. I know you're terrified of all the monsters that you've made up in your mind that's in this water. Why don't you come and walk on the water to me. And it's one thing that, but the fearful thing wasn't him walking on the water, because later on, Peter jumps in the water to go swim to shore in John 21. He wasn't obviously afraid to jump in the water. He wasn't afraid to fall in. There was turbulence. And Jesus is out there and he says, don't be afraid. Comes walking on the water, Then, of course, he falls in, But anyway, I just got thinking about that. That's the real music, Zane, isn't it? The real music isn't Andrea Bocelli or whoever else on the radio. In fact, the radio, after a while, can start to hurt our ears and our ability to hear. And so I wrote this little song.